It was late evening, the kind of quiet hour when most people were heading home after a long day. The city had started to slow down. The streets were dimly lit, with the soft orange glow of lamps stretching across the empty highway. A black sedan rolled down the road, moving calmly under the fading light. Behind the wheel sat a man who had spent more than 2 decades serving his country. He was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a title that carried both power and heavy responsibility. But that night he wasn't thinking about power or status. He had just finished attending a national security meeting that went on longer than expected. His mind was tired but alert, his thoughts drifting between work, duty, and the quiet peace of returning home. He wasn't in his usual government car with drivers and security detail. He preferred whenever possible to drive himself, a small way to stay grounded. After years of dealing with politicians, reports, and national threats, these solo drives helped him breathe, helped him remember the world beyond meetings and paperwork. The road stretched long and quiet ahead. He turned up the radio slightly, letting a soft tune fill the car. The sound reminded him of simpler days before the title, before the politics, before the constant pressure to appear flawless in front of cameras. He smiled faintly at the thought. It was one of those small smiles people give when they know life has changed forever, but they still try to hold on to small pieces of normalcy. The air was cool, and the night breeze slipped in through the window. He loosened his tie and relaxed his shoulders. It felt good to drive without being watched. No press, no advisors, no subordinates waiting for orders. Just him, the road, and the sound of the tires rolling gently on the asphalt. He was about 20 minutes from home when he noticed bright lights flash in his rearview mirror. Blue and red lights. A police car. At first he thought they were rushing to an emergency somewhere else. He slowed down slightly to let them pass. But the patrol car didn't move ahead. It stayed behind him, the lights still flashing. Then came the short burst of the siren. He frowned slightly and pulled to the side of the road. Maybe there was a mix-up. Maybe they needed assistance. He was, after all, a federal officer, though tonight he wore no badge on his chest, just a dark jacket over his shirt. He turned off the radio and waited calmly. Seconds later, the bright beam of a spotlight hit his side mirror, nearly blinding him. He shielded his eyes and rolled down his window. He could see 2 officers stepping out of the patrol car behind him. Their movements were sharp and aggressive. One of them had a hand resting on his holster. The director took a slow breath. He had dealt with tense encounters before, but something about this felt different. There was no reason for such intensity. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't broken any law. He stayed composed and kept both hands clearly on the steering wheel. The officers approached fast. One of them yelled from behind the flashlight's glare, "Turn off the engine and put your hands where I can see them." He complied instantly, speaking in a calm voice. "Officer, my hands are right here. I'm reaching for nothing." No response. Only louder commands. "Step out of the vehicle, now." He hesitated for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they didn't recognize him. Maybe this was just confusion. Still, his instinct told him to stay polite. "I'm a federal officer," he said, trying to explain. "I have my identification in the glove box." But his words seemed to make no difference. The tone of the officers grew sharper. "Step out."
"Do it now."
He slowly opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands raised high. His voice remained steady. "I'm cooperating," he said, trying to stay measured. The cold night air touched his face as he stood beside the car. The road was silent except for the hum of the patrol car engine and the sound of one officer's boots scraping the ground. The other officer had his flashlight trained directly on him, the beam cutting through the dark. The director tried again to speak, this time with calm authority. "Please, there's been a misunderstanding. My credentials are inside the car. I'm the director of—" "Don't move," the first officer barked. "Hands where I can see them." He froze. Inside, his pulse quickened, but he didn't let fear show. Years of discipline had taught him that reacting emotionally in moments like this only made things worse. He thought about how strange it was. After everything he had done for law enforcement, here he was, standing by the side of the road like a suspect. He had spent years building programs to improve policing standards, to train officers on restraint and professionalism. Yet in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. He noticed how tense the officers were, their posture, their tone, their heavy breathing. It was the look of people ready to assume the worst. and he wondered quietly what it was they saw in him that made them feel so threatened. "Turn around. Hands on the hood," one of them ordered. He obeyed. The metal felt cold under his palms. The air felt heavier now, filled with unspoken tension. He could hear one officer whisper to the other, "Check the car," and then footsteps moving away. He kept his head down, breathing evenly, replaying the situation in his mind. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't even changed lanes improperly. The only explanation that made sense was that they saw a man driving late at night in a nice car, and assumed something. Minutes passed. To him, they felt like hours. He heard one of the officers muttering near the back of his car, then silence. Finally, the one closest to him spoke again. "What's your name?" He said it clearly. "I'm the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The officer paused for a moment, almost in disbelief. "Say that again?" He repeated it. "I'm a federal officer. My credentials are inside the glove box. You can check." Another silence. Then the second officer returned, holding his wallet. The flashlight beam shook slightly as the man flipped it open and saw the gold badge and ID card. Everything stopped. The officer's voice dropped an octave. Sir, we didn't realize—" The director stayed quiet. He didn't move, didn't even turn around yet. The anger he might have felt was buried under years of self-control. The second officer stepped closer, suddenly trying to sound respectful. "Sir, please." "You can relax. It's just that we thought—" He didn't finish the sentence. There was no good way to explain what they thought. The director slowly turned around, his eyes calm but unreadable. He said softly, "You thought wrong." The two men exchanged nervous looks. The spotlight flicked off. The atmosphere shifted from command to panic. The police chief arrived minutes later, called in by the officers. He rushed out of his car, clearly horrified when he realized who was standing on the roadside. The apologies began immediately. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry," the chief said. "They didn't know. It was dark, dark," the director repeated quietly. "Yes, it was." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one spoke after that. The director simply nodded, walked back to his car, and drove off without another word. As the road opened up again, the adrenaline finally faded, leaving a hollow feeling in his chest. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. He wasn't angry, and not yet. He was disappointed, deeply disappointed, for a man who had dedicated his entire life to justice. Being treated like a criminal was more than humiliation. It was proof of something he had long feared but never experienced so personally. That even in a position of power, he wasn't protected from prejudice. The drive home felt endless. The city lights blurred as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. His phone buzzed with messages, but he ignored them. He didn't want to talk, not yet. When he finally pulled into his driveway, he sat in silence for a long time before turning off the engine. The night outside was quiet again, just like before. But he was no longer the same man who had started that drive. He walked into his house, loosened his tie completely, and stood by the window for a while, looking out at the stillness of the street. The faint reflection of his own face stared back at him. He thought about the two officers and their fear, their assumptions, their tone. He thought about the training sessions he had approved, the policies he had pushed, the endless meetings about improving community relations, and then he thought about how easily everything could have ended differently. He sat down on the couch, his mind heavy. He didn't plan to tell anyone right away. Maybe tomorrow he'd figure out what to do. But deep down he already knew this night wouldn't stay hidden. The truth always had a way of finding light. He exhaled slowly, resting his head back against the cushion. In the stillness of that moment, one thought echoed quietly in his mind. A thought that would soon echo across the entire country. "If this can happen to me," he whispered to himself, "what about everyone else?" And with that, the man who had once believed he had seen it all realized there were still truths in this world that even he had been blind to. The next morning began quietly. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, touching the living room walls with a soft golden glow. The house was calm, but the air felt heavy. The director sat alone at his dining table, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, flashes of last night returned. The red and blue lights, the shouting voices, the cold metal under his palms. He kept asking himself the same question. How did this happen? For years he had been on the other side of the law, the one giving orders, setting standards, speaking about accountability. Now he had lived through the same fear that ordinary people described in stories he once thought he understood. He looked at his phone. Dozens of messages blinked on the screen. Some were from colleagues asking about upcoming meetings, others from friends checking if he had reached home safely after the late-night conference. He didn't reply to any of them. He just sat there quietly thinking. After a while, he stood up and walked to his study. His badge and service pistol lay neatly in a small drawer. He stared at the badge for a long time, the symbol of everything he had worked for, everything he believed in. It suddenly looked different. Last night, that small piece of metal hadn't protected him at all. He closed the drawer and sat down at his desk. The silence around him was loud. Around mid-morning, his phone rang again. This time, it was one of his deputies. The voice on the other end sounded nervous. "Sir, have you seen what's online?" He frowned slightly. "Online? What do you mean?" "Someone uploaded footage from last night," the deputy said hesitantly. "A resident recorded it from across the street. It's already being shared everywhere." He didn't respond for a moment. The words took time to sink in. "There's video?" he finally asked. "Yes, sir." "It's spreading fast. People are reacting." He thanked the deputy and hung up. Then with a deep breath, he opened his laptop. Within seconds, he saw it. A grainy video posted on social media, already with thousands of shares. The caption read, "FBI director pulled over and held at gunpoint by local police." He clicked play. There he was, standing by his car with his hands raised, the police shouting in the background. Even though the footage was distant, it captured the tone clearly. The harshness, the tension, the disbelief in his voice when he said who he was. He watched the clip in silence. Then he scrolled through the comments. People from across the country were outraged. Some couldn't believe it had happened. Others said it showed how deep the problem really was. A few tried to defend the officers, saying they were just doing their job. He closed the laptop slowly. The story was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone now. Within an hour, his phone started buzzing nonstop. Reporters, government officials, colleagues, all trying to reach him. But he didn't pick up. He needed time to think, to breathe, to decide how to respond. Later that day, the head of the local police department called him personally. The man's voice trembled slightly as he apologized again and again. "Sir, we're truly sorry for what happened. The officers are being questioned. We assure you this isn't how we operate." The director listened quietly. When the man finished, he spoke in a calm, low tone. "Chief, you say this isn't how you operate, but it is how too many people are treated every day. The only difference is that last night it happened to someone with a title." The chief didn't know how to respond. There was only silence on the line. The director ended the call politely and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. A deep, personal hurt. He wasn't angry for himself. He was angry for everyone who never got the chance to prove who they were. For everyone who wasn't believed. By the afternoon, the story had reached every major news outlet. Television screens showed clips of the video. Talk shows debated whether the officers should be punished. Political commentators spoke about accountability, racial bias, and law enforcement standards. Everyone had an opinion, but the director stayed silent. He didn't issue a statement. He didn't attend any meetings. He simply watched, observing how quickly the world could spin a story without knowing the person at its center. Later that evening, one of his closest advisors came to visit him. The advisor had known him for years, from the time he was just a field agent trying to make a difference. "Everyone's waiting to hear from you," the advisor said gently. "They're asking why you haven't said anything yet." The director nodded. "Because words won't fix this. Not yet." The advisor looked concerned. "People are angry. They want leadership. They need to hear from you, not as a victim, but as the head of the bureau." He looked out the window for a long moment. "If I speak now," he said softly, "it'll sound like I'm speaking for myself. I want to speak for what's right." "There's a difference." The advisor understood and didn't press further. Before leaving, he said, "Just remember, silence can be powerful but only for a time. Eventually, people will demand more." That night, as the city lights flickered in the distance, the director finally sat down at his desk again. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing. Not an official statement, but his thoughts. Simple, honest words he wrote about fear, about respect, about how trust between law enforcement and the people was fragile, built over years but broken in seconds. He wrote about what it felt like to be treated as less than human, even when you had spent your life serving the nation. By midnight, he folded the paper neatly and placed it in his drawer. He didn't know yet if he'd ever read it publicly, but the act of writing brought him some peace. Meanwhile, the story outside his quiet home kept growing. Protests started forming in different cities. People held signs demanding justice and reform. For many, this wasn't just another headline. It was proof of everything they'd been saying for years. Somewhere in the middle of the chaos, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from the Attorney General's office. They wanted to schedule a press conference the next day. He hesitated before answering. He knew that once he spoke, there would be no turning back. "Tell them I'll be there," he finally said. The next morning, he arrived at the press building early. The halls were filled with staff, cameras, and reporters preparing for the event. As he walked in, people turned to look. Some nodded respectfully. Others whispered quietly. He took a moment to look at his reflection in the mirror before stepping onto the stage. The bright lights made his face look tired, but his eyes were steady. He wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to speak truthfully. When the camera started rolling, he began. "What happened to me last night," he said slowly, "was not just a mistake. It was a symptom of something deeper, something we've ignored for far too long. I wasn't stopped because I broke a law. I was stopped because of an assumption." The room fell silent. Reporters leaned in. He continued, "This isn't about one department or two officers. It's about what happens when fear replaces judgment and when bias hides behind authority. If this can happen to someone in my position, imagine what happens to those without a badge or title." He paused, letting his words settle. "I'm not here to attack anyone," he said softly. "I'm here to ask for change, real change. We can't keep pretending that these moments are accidents. We need accountability, training, and most importantly, humanity." When he finished speaking, the room stayed quiet for a moment before the questions began. But he didn't take any. He simply thanked everyone and walked away. Outside, the air felt lighter. For the first time since the incident, he felt like he had done something that mattered, not as a director, but as a person. As he drove home, he passed through the same stretch of road where everything had happened. The memories returned, but they didn't sting as sharply this time. He slowed down, looking at the spot under the streetlight where he had stood just 2 nights ago. He remembered the sound of the officers' voices, the cold metal of the car, the stillness afterward. Then he took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and kept driving. The world was still watching. His words would echo across newsrooms and living rooms for days to come. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead, when for him, for the Bureau, and for the country, was long. But for the first time in a while, he felt that maybe. The next few days were a blur. The director's short speech had gone everywhere. Every news channel, every newspaper, every corner of the internet. Some called it one of the most powerful statements ever made by a government official. Others called it controversial. The video of him standing calmly behind the podium, speaking with honesty instead of anger, had struck something deep in people. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet and real, and that's what made it hit harder. But with the attention came noise. Reporters camped outside his home. Protesters gathered downtown, holding signs that quoted his words. Political commentators argued endlessly on TV. Some praised his courage. Others said he was embarrassing the system. Inside his house, the director kept his days simple. He still woke up early, exercised, and went to his office. But something had changed inside him. The routine felt heavier now. Every meeting, every phone call carried an unspoken tension. On the surface, the Bureau stood behind him. But behind closed doors, whispers started spreading. Some senior officials thought he had gone too far, that his public statement made the organization look divided. Others secretly admired him but didn't have the courage to say it aloud. During one internal meeting, he could sense the unease in the room. The deputy director spoke first, choosing his words carefully. "Sir," he began, "there's growing concern about how this situation is affecting the Bureau's image. The media keeps using your name alongside Words like racial profiling, bias, and systemic problems. Some officials feel it's pulling attention away from our main priorities. The director listened quietly, then said, "If the truth takes attention away from our priorities, maybe our priorities need to change." The room went silent. A few people avoided eye contact. He wasn't trying to be confrontational. He was just tired of pretending that image mattered more than honesty. He had spent years trying to improve the agency from within, but moments like this reminded him how hard real change was. Later that afternoon, he received a call from a senior figure in the administration. The voice on the other end was polite, but the message was clear. "Director, you've always been respected, but this situation is becoming politically sensitive. Some are suggesting it might be best if you keep a lower profile for a while." He smiled faintly at the irony. "A lower profile?" he repeated. "After what happened, silence isn't the answer." There was a pause, then the voice said, "Just think about it, sir. The Bureau's reputation, and yours, depends on balance." When the call ended, he sat still for a long time. The word balance echoed in his mind. Balance between truth and politics, between what was right and what was expected. That night he went for a walk near his home. The air was crisp and the neighborhood quiet. Streetlights glowed softly, reflecting off the wet pavement. He needed space to think, away from cameras, away from advisors. As he walked, he noticed a couple sitting on a bench. They recognized him and stood up quickly. "Sir," the man said, "we just wanted to thank you. What you said, it meant a lot. My brother went through something like that years ago. Nobody believed him. Hearing you talk about it gave us hope." The director smiled gently and nodded. "Thank you. I only spoke the truth." As he walked away, he thought about the thousands of people who had reached out since the incident. Letters, emails, messages, and all saying the same thing. "Thank you for speaking up." But for every message of support, there were others filled with anger. Some accused him of turning against law enforcement. Others said he was making it about race. It was the same pattern he'd seen for years: denial, defensiveness, distraction. Still, he refused to let bitterness take root. He reminded himself that true change never comes easily. The following week, the Department of Justice announced that the officers involved were being placed under internal review. It sounded official, but he knew what that usually meant: time, paperwork, and quiet resolutions. He wasn't out for revenge. He didn't want anyone ruined. What he wanted was acknowledgement, an open admission that something was wrong and needed fixing, but instead, the story began to shift. Some media outlets started running different headlines. Was the director's behavior during the stop appropriate? Or new questions raised about federal protocol? He could see it happening. The slow attempt to twist the story. It was the same tactic he'd watched unfold many times in his career, when those in power wanted to protect themselves. One evening, his communications advisor came to his office holding a stack of papers. "You need to see this," she said. The papers contained internal reports, anonymous complaints suggesting the director had mishandled the situation during the stop. There were claims that he had failed to properly identify himself. He read them quietly, page after page, until the words blurred. "These are lies," he said calmly. The advisor sighed. "I know, but someone's pushing them hard, probably to distract from the real issue." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "So now I'm the problem." She hesitated before answering. "They're scared. When people are scared, they attack what they can't control." He nodded slowly. It wasn't the first time he'd faced pressure, but this felt different. This was personal. That night, he received an email from one of his field agents, someone young, still idealistic. It was short but heartfelt. "Sir, what happened to you made me realize how important fairness is. I joined this job to protect people. Please don't let them silence you." The message stayed with him. It reminded him why he had joined law enforcement in the first place, not for power, but for justice. The next morning, he returned to work as usual. But when he entered his office, he noticed how quiet the building was. Conversation stopped when he walked by. People avoided his eyes. He could feel it, the invisible line being drawn. Some were afraid to be seen supporting him. Others simply didn't know what to believe anymore. At noon, he received a message from the Oversight Committee requesting his presence at a private review session. He knew exactly what that meant. During the session, a panel of senior officials asked him a series of pointed questions. about his conduct, his judgment, his decision to speak publicly. One of them said, "You should have let the Bureau handle the matter internally. Going public was unnecessary." He looked directly at them and said, "I went public because the people deserve honesty. If you keep everything behind closed doors, nothing changes." Another official leaned forward. "With all due respect, Director, we have procedures. You may have unintentionally undermined trust in law enforcement." He shook his head slightly. "No, the truth doesn't undermine trust. Hiding it does." The room went silent again. After the session ended, he walked out feeling strangely calm. He knew what was coming. He could sense it in their careful tone, their measured words. They were preparing to push him out, quietly, respectfully, but deliberately. That evening, as he left the building, a group of journalists waited outside. Microphones and cameras surrounded him instantly. "Director, do you think the government is retaliating against you? Are you planning to resign?" He stopped for a moment, looking at the flashing lights and eager faces. Then he said softly, "I didn't come this far to back down from the truth." And with that, he walked to his car and drove away. That night, he sat at home in silence again. The noise outside and the news, the rumors, the politics, and all faded for a moment. He stared at the city lights through his window, remembering the man he had been before all this began. He thought about the officers who had stopped him. He wondered if they understood what they had done, not just to him, but to the faith people had in the system. He thought about the Bureau, the colleagues who now avoided him, the officials who once praised him but now spoke cautiously behind closed doors. But most of all, he thought about the people, ordinary citizens who had written to him, strangers who saw in him a reflection of their own struggles. For them, he knew he couldn't give up. He took out the same piece of paper he had written on days ago, the one filled with his private thoughts. This time he added new lines. He wrote, "Change begins when silence ends. If they try to take away my position, they can have it, but they will never take my voice." He placed the paper back in his drawer, stood up, and looked out at the night one more time. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. He knew that. But he also knew something else. This wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet, to wait, to accept things as they were, and he had no intention of staying quiet again. The next morning, the quiet of dawn was replaced by chaos. The video of the roadside incident had leaked online overnight. By the time the director woke up, his phone was vibrating nonstop. News alerts, missed calls, and hundreds of unread messages filled his screen. At first, he thought it was some kind of mistake. Then he opened a video link sent by one of his staff members and saw himself on the screen, kneeling on the pavement with his hands behind his head, surrounded by two shouting officers. The image was clear, raw, and painful. Within hours, the footage spread everywhere. News channels played it on repeat. Social media was flooded with outrage, comments, and hashtags demanding justice. People were shocked that something like this could happen to the head of a federal agency. It wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It had become a symbol of everything people were tired of seeing. The director sat on his couch watching the news, feeling a strange mix of disbelief and exhaustion. His wife stood nearby, holding her coffee, her face pale and quiet. She didn't say much, just placed her hand on his shoulder. He could tell she was hurt, not just for him, but for what it meant. For years, she'd watched him work hard, believing his position would protect him from such treatment. Now that illusion was gone. His assistant called soon after. The phone barely stopped ringing. She told him the situation was out of control. Reporters were outside his house. The FBI's media department was trying to craft a response. The Attorney General wanted a briefing immediately. It felt surreal. One night he was just driving home, and the next morning his name was being spoken on every major network in the country. He finally decided to give a short statement. Standing in front of his home, dressed simply in a dark suit, he faced a sea of microphones and flashing cameras. His voice stayed calm, though his eyes revealed a deep sadness. He said he was thankful to be alive, disappointed by what happened, and hopeful that the truth would bring change. He didn't attack anyone or speak out of anger. He just said he wanted to use this moment to start a conversation about respect, fairness, and accountability. His measured words were powerful. They spread fast. Many people praised his grace and patience. Some called him a hero for not losing his temper that night. Others felt angry on his behalf. saying he should have spoken more strongly. But he had always believed in dignity, even in moments of humiliation. Inside government offices, though, the reaction was far more complicated. High-ranking officials were nervous. They saw how the story was growing, how the headlines were making the agency look divided. Some worried that his public statement would make things worse. In private meetings, a few even questioned why he didn't keep quiet and let internal channels handle it. They called it unnecessary exposure, but he didn't regret speaking. He knew silence would make it seem like he accepted what happened. Still, he could sense that people around him were beginning to distance themselves. Calls from colleagues felt shorter. Some stopped checking in altogether. He noticed how certain smiles disappeared in meetings, replaced by polite stiffness. The following week was a blur. News vans lined the street outside his house. Protesters gathered near the city square holding signs with his image and slogans about justice. For the first time in his long career, he was the story, not the one telling it. He met with the FBI's Internal Affairs Division to discuss the details of the incident. They promised a fair investigation, but he knew how slow and political such processes could be. Every word he said was recorded, every expression studied. He stayed careful, professional, and honest, even when it was uncomfortable. That same week, the local police department held a press conference. Their chief called the event a misunderstanding that escalated due to miscommunication. The officers involved, though suspended, were not charged. The director watched that press conference alone in his living room. He knew what those words meant. It was an attempt to calm public anger without admitting fault. Days turned into weeks. The public attention grew even larger. Late-night hosts made references to the story. Law professors debated it on talk shows. Civil rights groups demanded reform. The director's face became a symbol in discussions about racial bias and law enforcement accountability. But as the spotlight grew, so did the pressure inside the bureau. Meetings became tense. Some of his deputies advised him to step back from the public eye until the situation cooled down. He could tell it wasn't about his safety, it was about their discomfort. He represented an issue they didn't want to face. One evening, after a long day at headquarters, he sat alone in his office staring at the framed photos on his wall. Pictures of him shaking hands with presidents, addressing graduating agents, visiting communities. Reminders of decades of service. He remembered how proud he felt when he took the oath, believing his agency was a place of fairness and honor. Now sitting there under the soft glow of the desk lamp, he wondered if that belief had been naive. He wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of explaining his existence, tired of trying to be perfect to prove a point. He had done everything right that night, followed orders, stayed calm, identified himself. And still, it wasn't enough. What more could a man do? A few close friends from the bureau came to see him that week. They were supportive but cautious. One of them warned him quietly that some officials were trying to find a reason to question his conduct that night. "They're saying you reached for your ID too quickly," his friend said. "They're building a narrative." The director didn't respond. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. He knew how these things worked. When powerful institutions felt threatened, they often looked for someone to sacrifice to restore calm. Despite all this, he kept showing up to work every morning, performing his duties with the same discipline as before. But he could feel the whispers following him down the hallways. Every move he made seemed to be watched, every decision second-guessed. Meanwhile, ordinary people continued to send him letters and messages of support. Some shared their own stories of discrimination. Others simply thanked him for his courage. Reading those words gave him strength. They reminded him that the real purpose of his work wasn't titles or politics. It was people. One afternoon, he was invited to speak at a small community gathering. At first, he hesitated, worried it might seem like he was using the situation for attention. But he went anyway. Standing before the crowd, he spoke simply. He told them he didn't want sympathy, only understanding. He said what happened to him could happen to anyone. And that real change starts when people stop pretending it doesn't. His voice cracked slightly when he said that. And for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd endured. The audience stood and applauded. Some were in tears. In that moment, he realized that maybe this painful experience had a purpose beyond his own suffering. Maybe it could wake people up. As he drove home that night, the streets looked different. The lights blurred softly through the windshield. He felt both heavier and freer, heavy with the burden of what had happened, but free from the fear of speaking truth. He knew the road ahead would be rough. Powerful people were already moving pieces behind the scenes. But he also knew he couldn't go back to silence. He had spent a lifetime defending the idea of justice. Now he was living proof that justice must never depend on a uniform or a title. It had to belong to everyone equally. Back at home, he found his wife waiting by the window. She asked how it went, and he just smiled faintly. "It was good," he said. People listened. That night, as he sat alone once again, he looked out into the dark sky and wondered how something so wrong could become a turning point for something right. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but deep inside he felt a quiet strength returning, the same kind that had carried him through years of service. Whatever happened next, he was ready to face it. Weeks passed since the public statement, and though the noise outside had started to quiet down, the tension inside the bureau was heavier than ever. What had begun as a moment of truth was now being twisted into something entirely different. The director had noticed it in the way people looked at him. Polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes, conversations that stopped the moment he entered a room, meetings that used to start with warmth now felt stiff, rehearsed. Even the staff who once admired him had grown cautious, like they didn't know which side to stand on. He didn't blame them. Fear moved faster than truth in places like this. One morning, as he sat in his office reviewing a case file, his assistant came in with a hesitant look. She told him that certain reports were circulating, claims that he had handled the incident improperly and failed to follow internal communication protocol. He stared at her for a moment, trying to process it. The words made no sense. He had been the victim, yet somehow, now he was being turned into the problem. He asked where the reports came from, but she didn't have an answer. "Someone up the chain," she said softly. "They're saying the Bureau's credibility was damaged because of how public everything became." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. It was exactly what he had feared, the slow turning of the wheel that crushed anyone who embarrassed powerful people. The next few days were filled with quiet storms. He was called into a series of internal discussions where senior officials spoke in carefully chosen words. They praised his long service, then hinted that maybe stepping aside temporarily would help cool the situation. It wasn't said directly, but the message was clear. They wanted him out of sight. He listened, nodding politely, never raising his voice. But inside, something in him started to ache. He had given decades of his life to this institution, building it on integrity, protecting its name, defending its agents, and now, the same system was trying to erase him for the sake of comfort. At home, his wife could see the exhaustion in his face. He tried to act calm, but the strain showed in the way he sat quietly at dinner, barely touching his food. She reminded him that he had nothing to prove, that truth would speak for itself. But he knew better. In his world, truth often came second to politics. The press had moved on to other stories, but his name still floated in the background. Pundits debated whether he had handled things professionally. Some accused him of turning the Bureau into a political battleground. Others said he should have done more to defend himself. Everyone had an opinion except those who actually knew what it felt like to live through it. One afternoon, while walking through the hallway, he overheard two younger agents whispering. They didn't see him there. One of them said, "They're talking about replacing him soon. It's already being discussed upstairs." The words hit him hard, though he didn't react. He just kept walking. That evening, he stayed in his office long after everyone had gone home. The halls were quiet, and only the faint hum of the air conditioner filled the space. He looked at the framed flag behind his desk, the one he had saluted when he was sworn in. It had always stood for something pure in his mind: loyalty, duty, justice. But now, it felt like a reminder of how fragile ideals could be when surrounded by fear. The next week, he received an official notice. It said he was being placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. The reason cited was potential procedural oversight during the traffic stop. He sat staring at the letter for a long time, the words blurring on the page. It was a cruel irony. He was being punished for surviving a moment he had no control over. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in his drawer, and leaned back in silence. When the news broke, it didn't take long for headlines to appear again. FBI director under review following controversial stop. The same outlets that once called him brave now questioned his leadership. The public didn't know what to believe anymore. Confusion had replaced outrage. A few of his close colleagues came to visit him during that time. They expressed sympathy but kept their words cautious, as if afraid their support might cost them too. One of them said quietly, "They're trying to protect the agency's image. Someone has to take the fall." He smiled sadly. "And that someone is me," he replied. He spent his days reading, taking long walks and trying not to let bitterness take over. He'd seen how bitterness could destroy a person. He'd seen it in agents who'd lost faith in the system. He didn't want that to be him. But there were nights when it was hard. He would sit on the porch staring at the streetlights, remembering the moment the officers shouted at him, the sound of gravel under his knees, the cold fear in his chest. It wasn't the humiliation that haunted him most, it was how quickly people forgot. The investigation dragged on. Weeks turned into months. He received formal questions to answer, written statements about his conduct, timelines to verify, details to recall. It felt absurd answering for something that had been captured clearly on camera. But he complied with everything, because he still believed in due process even when it was being used against him. During that time, he received hundreds of letters from ordinary citizens. Some told him not to give up. Others said his story gave them courage to speak out against their own experiences. He kept every letter in a box near his desk, reading them when the silence became too heavy. Then one morning, he received a call from a friend still inside the bureau. The voice on the other end sounded uneasy. "They're finalizing something," the friend said. "A few senior officials met privately last night. I think they're preparing for your resignation announcement." He didn't say anything for a moment. He just listened to the sound of the wind outside his window. "Thank you," he finally said. "That means a lot." When he hung up, he sat quietly, letting the weight of the words sink in. Resignation. It wasn't a surprise anymore. He'd seen it coming for weeks. But hearing it confirmed still hurt deeply. Later that day, he met with the Attorney General in a closed meeting. They exchanged formal greetings, but the atmosphere was heavy. The Attorney General spoke softly, explaining that the situation had become too divisive and that the Bureau needed to move forward. Then came the offer. An opportunity to resign gracefully, citing personal reasons. He nodded slowly, not out of agreement but understanding. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to know that fighting would only make things worse. The machine had already made its decision. That night he drafted his resignation letter. He kept it short and dignified, expressing gratitude for the years of service and faith in the mission of justice. He didn't mention the incident or the investigation. There was no bitterness in his words, only quiet acceptance. The next morning, the news broke. FBI director steps down, citing personal reasons. The headline sounded clean and polite, like nothing tragic had happened. Behind those words, though, was a story of betrayal. Not by one person, but by a system too afraid to face its own reflection. When he left his office for the last time, the hallways were strangely empty. A few staff members came to shake his hand. Some couldn't even look him in the eye. He walked slowly through the corridors, remembering the countless moments he had spent there. Moments of pride, purpose, and dedication. As he reached the lobby, he paused for a moment, looking back. For years, that building had been his second home. Now it felt distant, almost foreign. He smiled faintly, not in sadness, but in peace. He had done his best, and that was enough. Outside, his car was waiting. The air was cool, the city quieter than usual. He took one last glance at the tall glass windows behind him, then got in and drove away without saying a word. He didn't know what the future held. But somewhere deep inside, he felt that maybe this was not an end, just a turning point. Because even though he had lost his title, he hadn't lost his truth. And truth, he thought, has a way of finding light again, no matter how many times people try to hide it. When he left the bureau, the world around him seemed quieter, almost distant. For the first time in years, there were no early morning briefings, no urgent calls, no meetings lined up one after another. The silence felt strange. Some days it felt like peace. Other days it felt like loss. He tried to keep himself busy. He spent time walking through the park near his home, often in the early mornings when the air was cool and the streets were empty. He liked watching people start their days. Joggers, parents with strollers, the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. It reminded him of what he had always worked for: safety, peace, fairness. Things most people never think twice about until they lose them. His wife stood by him through everything. She didn't ask too many questions. She just understood. There were moments when they would sit together on the porch in silence, sipping coffee and listening to the distant sounds of the city. Sometimes she would glance at him and say softly, "You did the right thing," and he would nod, even though deep inside he still struggled to believe it fully. The first few weeks after his resignation, reporters still tried to reach him. They wanted interviews, comments, statements. He turned them all down. He didn't want to relive the pain or turn it into entertainment for the news cycle. He wanted to breathe again, to find meaning beyond the title he once carried. But the story didn't fade. People continued to talk about what had happened. Documentaries mentioned it, podcasts discussed it, and students wrote essays about it. His face became a quiet reminder of how fragile fairness could be in the hands of those meant to protect it. After a while, community leaders began reaching out. They wanted him to speak at schools, at local gatherings, at universities. At first he said no, he didn't feel ready. But one day a small-town teacher wrote him a heartfelt letter. She told him her students had seen the video and couldn't understand how someone at his level could be treated that way. She asked if he would come talk to them, not as a former official, but as a man who had lived through it. He hesitated, then agreed. When he arrived at the school, he was met with quiet respect. The students listened closely as he spoke, their faces curious, thoughtful. He didn't give a speech filled with anger or blame. Instead, he talked about what it meant to stay calm when the world tested you. He spoke about forgiveness, dignity, and the importance of never losing faith in doing what's right, even when right doesn't win immediately. Afterward, a student came up to him and said, "You made me want to be a better person, not just a better officer someday." That single sentence stayed with him. It reminded him that maybe his story could still do some good. From then on, he started speaking more often. He visited universities, community centers, even police academies. His talks weren't about politics, and they were about humanity. He told stories from his career, about the people he'd met, the good he'd seen, and the flaws that still needed fixing. He always ended his talks with the same line: "Justice isn't a position, it's a promise. And a promise means nothing if it's not kept." Over time, he noticed how people began treating him differently, not as a fallen official but as a symbol of endurance. Journalists wrote pieces calling him the man who stood tall in silence. Advocacy groups invited him to join their reform efforts. He declined most offers, choosing to stay independent. He didn't want politics to twist his message. One evening, while speaking at a small event, a retired officer approached him afterward. The man had tears in his eyes as he said, "I was one of those who doubted your story at first. But after seeing what happened, I realized we have a problem that we can't keep ignoring. You made me want to be better." Hearing that touched him deeply. It was moments like that which reminded him why he had chosen to speak. He didn't need revenge, and he needed change. At home, life was simple. He helped his wife in the garden, took care of small chores, and spent evenings reading books he never had time for before. Sometimes, when the news mentioned the bureau or the city police, he would turn the volume down. It still hurt, even if he didn't say it. A few years later, he was invited to a major civil rights forum in Washington. Leaders from different backgrounds gathered to discuss reform and fairness in law enforcement. When he took the stage, the audience stood and clapped for nearly a minute before he even spoke. He looked around, humbled, and said, "I didn't come here for applause. I came here because silence helps no one." He told his story again, this time with a quiet confidence that came from acceptance. He spoke about fear, bias, and courage, not as ideas but as experiences. He reminded them that justice could only survive when everyone cared enough to protect it, not just when it was convenient. After his talk, a young officer approached him and said, "Sir, I just joined the force last year. I'll remember your story every time I put on this uniform." The director smiled gently and replied, "That's all I ever wanted, for the next ones to do better." As months passed, small changes began to happen in local departments across the country. Training programs were updated, awareness sessions were introduced, and conversations that once felt uncomfortable started becoming necessary. It wasn't a revolution, but it was something. and that something mattered. The director never claimed credit. He didn't seek recognition or attention. He simply kept sharing, teaching, and guiding. He believed that real impact didn't come from power but from persistence. One day, a journalist reached out to him again, asking if he had any regrets. He thought for a long moment before answering. If regret means wishing things had gone differently, then yes, maybe I do. But if regret means wanting to change who I became because of it, then no. I wouldn't trade what I've learned for anything. That quote ended up printed in newspapers and shared widely online. People called it wise. But for him, it wasn't wisdom. It was truth born from pain. Years later, as he grew older, his name was mentioned less often in the news. The world had moved on to new stories, new scandals, new heroes. Yet every so often his story resurfaced when people talked about courage and resilience. Students still studied the case in classes about ethics and justice. His calm face in that viral footage had become a reminder of dignity under pressure. In his final years, he lived quietly near the coast, where the sound of waves filled the evenings. He often sat on the shore, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the light fading slowly into calm darkness. Sometimes people recognized him and came up to thank him. He always greeted them with kindness, never tired of listening to their thoughts. He had come to accept that life was not about the titles we hold, but the truths we stand for when they're tested. Losing his job had once felt like the end of everything, but now, looking back, he realized it was the beginning of something deeper, a purpose that no position could define. Even after everything, he still believed in the law, in fairness, and the possibility of goodness. He knew systems could fail, but he also knew people could rise above them. That belief was what kept him at peace. In the years after his passing, people continued to speak his name with quiet respect. New recruits at the Bureau learned about his story during orientation, not as a warning but as a lesson in courage and humility. His portrait hung in a small hallway, not grand or decorated, but simple, a reminder of a man who faced injustice with grace and turned pain into purpose. And somewhere, in the hearts of those who heard his words, his message lived on, that no matter how dark things seem, truth always finds its way to light, because in the end, he didn't just lose a title. He found something greater, the power of conscience and the peace that comes when you stand for what's right even when you stand alone.